Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time we're going to try to wrap our heads around First-Worldism, commentary on a new nationalism.
Definitely a challenging piece.
You guys sent this in, and I got to say, it's a dense one, but we're ready for it.
Yeah, we're going to unpack this idea of first worldism and how this author redefines nationalism.
All right, so the author starts off by defining nationalism, right? And it's not that, raw, stereotypical kind of way.
Not the jingoistic.
Yeah, exactly. It's more like a shared identity, with people of your lineage, culture, region, history.
Like an extended family. You know how you feel about your cousins and your aunts and uncles, even if you don't see them that often?
Yeah, there's this inherent connection, right?
Yeah.
But, defining specific nationalities can get a little messy.
Right, because,
Yeah.
take France.
Yeah.
Brittany, you have Burgundy. They're both French, but they also have their own cultures,
It's like those layers.
their own unique identities.
So you have these regional or tribal affiliations that might clash with this broader national identity.
And historically, that's played out in some dramatic ways, like the collapse of the Roman Empire or the Warring States period in Japan.
Wow, so it's like the glue just dissolved?
It's like everyone went back to their own little tribes.
Right. And, the author, they do kind of romanticize this idea of a world with a separate state for every nation, but then admit that would probably be chaos.
Yeah, it would probably be a disaster.
Total disaster. I mean, you think about all the conflicts throughout history just over land and independence.
Exactly. But then the author makes this interesting point that these smaller groups, they want to be independent, but they also often merge into larger empires for protection.
It's that age-old thing, freedom versus security.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. It makes you wonder if it's kind of an inevitable cycle.
Well, I mean, you can see that even today, like the EU, the UN, even the US in a way, there's this tension between wanting to go it alone and needing to band together.
And that brings up another point the author makes, which is that not all empires are created equal.
Okay, so break that down for me.
They make a distinction between authoritarianism and totalitarianism.
Okay.
So authoritarianism is about centralized power. Right. One person or a small group controls everything, but totalitarianism takes it a step further. It's about controlling every aspect of life, what people think, what they believe, even their private lives.
So in an authoritarian empire, you might still have some regional autonomy or cultural diversity.
Right, exactly. Whereas a totalitarian regime demands complete conformity.
Gotcha.
The Byzantine and Russian empires, they're examples of authoritarian empires that weren't necessarily totalitarian. They had centralized rule, but different regions still had some self-governance and cultural freedom.
That's really interesting because it challenges this common idea that all empires are just inherently evil and oppressive.
Right, it's more nuanced than that.
Okay, so how does this all tie back to nationalism, especially here in North America?
Well, that's where the author dives into the heart of the matter. They argue that both the U.S. and Canada are fundamentally European nations built on European principles and ideals.
So basically extensions of Europe carrying those European values across the Atlantic.
Precisely. And the author suggests that initially non-European populations were seen as separate from this Euro-North American identity.
Because of the differences in ethnicity and culture and history.
Yeah,
But obviously North America has always been incredibly diverse.
of course. And the author acknowledges that some minority groups did assimilate into the dominant European culture, either through intermarriage or by adopting European customs.
But that often came at a cost, right?
Yeah, they had to give up parts of their own heritage and identity.
So then how do you reconcile that idea of a shared national identity with the reality of such a diverse population?
Well, the author doesn't think integration should be automatic or assumed.
Okay.
They see it as a process that needs to be desired and earned.
It's not just about physically being there. You have to actually embrace the culture and values, even if it means letting go of some of your own traditions.
They even tell a story about a friend whose Dutch grandparents told their child to forget about being Dutch when they got to Canada and just be Canadian.
Wow. That's a pretty stark example.
Right.
But what about the people who don't assimilate either by choice or by circumstance? What does the author say about non-European populations who haven't fully adopted the dominant culture?
That's a great question, and that's where we're going to pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Ooh, cliffhanger alert. We're going to get into the successes and failures of different integration models and ultimately this controversial solution of First-Worldism.
It's going to be a good one.
All right, so we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back with part 2 of our deep dive into First-Worldism.
So we were talking about those who don't assimilate, right? The author points out that like African Americans and First Nations people, They've been here for generations, but haven't necessarily fully integrated into that European majority culture.
Yeah, it's a really complicated issue, and it feels like the author's pointing to a shift in how we've approached integration over time.
Exactly. They say that the West initially was all about assimilation, like, come on in, you got to blend in.
Mm.
But then it shifted towards multiculturalism, like, everyone keep your own traditions and we'll all just live together.
Which sounds great in theory.
Right. Celebrate diversity.
Yeah, but the author seems to think that this whole multiculturalism thing, it's not working out so well.
They actually come right out and say that multiculturalism is a failure, and they use the collapse of empires like Rome, Yugoslavia, the Russian Empire as examples.
It's like they're saying all that diversity just tore them apart from the inside.
Right. But is it really fair to compare those ancient empires to, like, modern democracies?
Good point.
Yeah, and the author acknowledges that there are differences, but they say even in modern societies, multiculturalism creates this permanent fifth column within the majority.
So it's like this built-in instability that could lead to things breaking apart.
It's exactly like balkanization, where societies fracture along those ethnic or cultural lines.
Okay, so if assimilation has its problems and multiculturalism's a no-go, what's the alternative? Is that where this first-worldism comes in?
You got it. That's the author's solution, and it's definitely going to ruffle some feathers.
Okay, lay it on me.
Basically, first worldism, it's all about preserving white European values, which they see as the same thing as first world values.
All right, we're getting into the controversial stuff now, but what exactly are these first world values? Do they like give a list?
They don't have a specific list, but they talk a lot about cultural and religious achievements being more important than like strict racial purity.
Okay.
They say diversity and miscegenation are going to happen anyway, especially like at the edges of society, but we shouldn't freak out about it or celebrate it.
So it's not about like creating a totally homogenous society, but more about keeping these certain values and norms that they think are crucial for a first world society to be successful.
That's the gist. Yeah, they use this analogy of a building. You need a strong foundation, but you don't just stop there. You build on top of it. You add all these layers of complexity and beauty.
So the first world values are the foundation. And even though they know diversity and cultural mixing will happen, they don't want to see those core values disappear or be replaced.
Exactly. And they argue that a strong, just society, it's not threatened by diversity or miscegenation as long as those core values are still there.
But then who gets to decide what those core values are? And what about the people who don't share those values? I mean, those are some pretty big questions.
Definitely. And one of the most interesting things is how they connect this first worldism idea with a belief in objective truth.
Hold on, what do they mean by objective truth in this context?
It's like they think there are certain fundamental truths about human nature and how societies work, and these truths just naturally lead to first world principles. Like anyone searching for truth, no matter their background, they'll eventually end up at these same conclusions.
So it's almost like they're presenting first worldism as some kind of universal standard based on these supposedly objective truths.
Yeah, but wouldn't that leave out anyone who doesn't agree with those specific values, even if they're a good person or have good intentions?
It seems like a bit of a contradiction. They're saying diversity is a reality, but also pushing for this very specific cultural and ideological framework that they believe is essential for a first world society to function.
And they admit it's tricky. They say it's hard to set clear standards, and there's bound to be some hypocrisy. But they also say that shouldn't stop us from trying to build a more cohesive society based on shared principles.
It's almost like a paradox, right? Saying there are objective truths while recognizing that everyone has their own perspective and values.
Right, like can there be objective standards in a world where everyone sees things differently? It's a debate that's been going on forever.
Yeah, no easy answers there. But bringing it back to the author's argument, one thing that stood out to me was how they tie conservatism to first worldism, which seemed a little odd since they also say they generally don't like conservatism.
It's another one of those nuanced points they make. They say that a true conservative, someone who really wants to conserve the values they care about, would naturally agree with the ideas of first worldism, even if their specific political beliefs aren't exactly the same as the author's.
So it's more about finding common ground based on this shared desire to preserve a certain way of life, a set of principles they think are crucial for a good society.
Exactly. And they bring up this example of Sikh immigrants defending Christian values in Canada to make that point.
Wow, that's a powerful image. It's like saying commitment to certain values can go beyond cultural or religious differences. But it also makes you wonder about assimilation and how complicated it can be to navigate different identities.
For sure, like, are those Sikh immigrants totally assimilated into Canadian society if they're descending Christian values? Or are they keeping their own identity while also accepting parts of the dominant culture? It's a gray area.
The author seems to admire their dedication to what they see as Canadian values, but also recognizes that tension between holding on to your heritage and taking on a new national identity.
And it brings us back to the heart of their argument. They believe a strong, unified society needs a shared foundation, a set of principles that connect people regardless of their background or beliefs. And for them, that foundation is First-Worldism.
It's definitely a bold and controversial idea, but it makes you think, especially now when the lines between cultures and identities are getting blurrier and blurrier.
Absolutely. It forces us to ask some tough questions about nationalism, identity, belonging. Where do we draw the lines? Who's in and who's out? What does it even mean to be part of a nation in today's globalized world?
Yeah, there's no simple answers. The author doesn't claim to have them all figured out, but just by bringing up these issues and making us question our assumptions, they've given us a lot to think about.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, right?
Yeah.
It's not about giving you the right answers. It's about exploring these complex ideas
Yeah.
and making you think critically.
Absolutely. And speaking of complex ideas, we still have that final provocative question to tackle. Can someone who's a progressive leftist or a communist, can they really be considered first world in their thinking and their spirit? That's where we'll pick up in the last part of our deep dive. Okay, so we're back and ready to tackle that last big question that the author throws at us. Can someone who's like a progressive leftist or a communist, can they really fit into this first world mentality and spirit?
It's a tough one. It really makes you think about what the core values are here.
Right, because on the surface, it seems like they clash. I mean, the author seems to be saying that if you lean towards those progressive, leftist, or communist ideas, you're basically rejecting the principles they see as essential for a first world society.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that the author isn't really getting into the specifics of all the different leftist or communist views. They're kind of lumping them together and focusing on this idea that those ideologies just fundamentally clash with their vision of a first world society.
So it's not so much about specific policies or political parties, it's more about a totally different way of seeing the world.
I think that's a big part of it. The author's saying that at their core, those ideologies go against the values they associate with first world success. Things like individual freedom, free markets, and a strong emphasis on traditional cultural norms.
It's definitely provocative, and it brings up so many questions like, what even is first world? Is it just about money and technology, or is there something deeper culturally and ideologically?
That's the heart of the matter, isn't it? The author's pushing for a bigger picture understanding of first world. It's not just about material wealth. It's about a certain set of values and cultural norms, too.
Which opens up a whole can of worms about whose values are universal or better than others.
Right, that's a whole other debate.
Yeah.
But I think what the author's trying to do here is make us think critically about the foundations of our societies. Are the values we have now really leading to the future we want?
It's a challenge to look at our own assumptions and have honest conversations about what kind of world we're building and what values we want to put first.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, I think that's something we can all get behind, no matter what our politics are or where we stand on this whole first-worldism idea.
Well said. This deep dive has taken us on a wild ride. We've unpacked nationalism and integration and wrestled with this controversial concept of first-worldism.
It's been a journey.
Yeah.
And even though the author has some strong opinions, I think the biggest takeaway for me is how important it is to really engage with these ideas, challenge our own biases, and have open conversations about what it means to build a fair and thriving society.
Couldn't agree more. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, we want to leave you with one last question to think about. What does first world mean to you? What values and principles do you think are essential for a good society?
Spend some time reflecting on those questions. Maybe even talk to someone who sees things differently. You might be surprised by what comes up.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into First-Worldism. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.